1, 2, 3, brothers, sisters, comrades, and friends. Welcome to Bat Country. Mr. B here. No, not really, but thank you for the homage, Shades of Clarity. There's no clear boundary beyond which you become an alcoholic. It's not like going through customs. No one stamps your passport or puts a Hawaiian lei over your head and says, "Welcome to alcoholism." It would be easier if that happened, wouldn't it? At least then you would know, right? You'd know where you crossed the line from alcohol use to alcohol use disorder. But it's not like that. For most of us, it's a slow slide into addiction. And it's hard to identify when we crossed the point of no return. It's hard to know when those hooks took hold in us, because usually by that point, by the time we noticed, it's often already too late. But looking back on my drinking years, which I do a lot, I think I've identified a few major red flags from my own history, and they kind of align quite well with the science that I've read. And when I say the science I've read, I mean the Huberman Labs podcast I listen to. It's kind of our Bible now. That's the new big book. And in doing that, in that process of reflecting on my own kind of alcoholic career, I think I have identified a genuinely useful threshold beyond which I discovered that I had an alcohol use disorder. There is a line in the sand for me where I went from using alcohol to having an alcohol use disorder. When I explain it at the end of this video, if you understand it, well, you'll know that you also need help. But first, a quick note on language, the kind of language that I use here. So, the word alcoholic is falling out of favour, and that's fine. Today, medical professionals prefer to use terms like alcohol use disorder or even problematic drinking or a variation of that phrase, because the word alcoholic, well, it carries a lot of kind of social and cultural stigma. I agree with that. Referring to somebody as an alcoholic implies a lack of control or some kind of personal or moral failing. It's just coded into that word. Whereas a phrase like person with alcohol use disorder or even a problem drinker does a better job of clinically and more accurately treating this thing as a disease. That clinical language is better at expressing the idea that this is a complex disease with genetic and psychological and environmental factors. And I agree with all of that. But in recovery rooms, there are very few of us who flinch from describing ourselves as alcoholics. So I tend to use the term alcoholic and person with alcohol use disorder kind of interchangeably. I'm not dogmatic about this stuff, but I also use the word alcoholic and alcoholism for kind of SEO purposes, right? Like if someone is having their first little inkling that they might have an alcohol use disorder, is it more likely that they're going to go to YouTube or go to Google and type in, "Do I have an alcohol use disorder?" or "Am I an alcoholic?" I want the people who are looking for this information to be able to find it easily. And if that means I have to trespass on some linguistic sensitivities, then so be it. Slayer Sober, who runs a really honest and kind of inspirational YouTube channel about sobriety, he was talking about this recently. And he made the point really well in a video that he called, "I Can't Stop Drinking, I Give Up." And he wasn't talking about himself. Any suspicions you have that that's a clickbaity title, set that aside, because what he was doing was something cleverer than that. He was making the point that people will use the language that's relevant and familiar to them when they're looking for help. For now, I'm still comfortable with the word alcoholic and alcoholism. If you're okay with that, then like and subscribe. If you're not, and you want to pick a fight with me, go and say mean things to me on Twitter or wherever you find me. Anyway, my introductions are always too long, and I need to learn to do shorter introductions and get to my point. Here we go. Okay, so Here are 5 things from my own history that might indicate that you have an alcohol use disorder if you experience them in the same way that I did. But these experiences also happen to align quite neatly with the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I need to look it up, hang on. I'm just going to pretend that I memorized it and edited it back in. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. That's the DSM-5 is a very large document which contains a pretty good framework for identifying alcohol use disorder. It's pretty common sense stuff in DSM-5, but it's a psychological book that outlines a framework for diagnosing any number of psychiatric and psychological issues. And that's become a kind of an important handbook for the diagnosis of alcohol use disorder. Number 5. You were a young drinker. You started young. The age that you started drinking is a major factor in the likelihood of you developing an alcohol use disorder later in life. If you're watching this video, I guess that means now. There is a direct correlation between the age you start drinking and the probability of you developing an alcohol use disorder later in life. It's directly linked. The younger you start, the more likely you're going to have trouble later. It's a perfectly straight line. And the problem with that is that it's already too late to do anything about it. That's already happened. It cannot be fixed or resolved. Sorry. I don't need to quote all the science and the research on this. Just go and watch the Huberman Labs video on alcohol. You probably have already. But the truth is we know that that is true just from experience. Just through common sense, we know that is true. Let's talk about me. I was a regular drinker by the age of 14. So regular would be to start with 1 weekend per month and then every weekend from about, halfway through my 14th year. But then we all were, we all were where I'm from. It's not even unusual. I grew up in farmland, kind of. From the front window of my house, you'd see nothing but towns and urban build-up for 100 kilometres. And then if you walk to the back of my house and then look out the back window, you see nothing but farmland and countryside for 100 kilometres. I lived right on that boundary. Growing up, we were surrounded by alcohol, by small country pubs, by drunken old farmers, homemade cider, lots of cider. God, I hate that shit. We were drinking cheap cider every weekend by the time I was 14, and it was cheap because it's made locally. And very quickly we advanced to what we would call special brew. I'm sure you have something similar from where you are. That was essentially any soft drink bottled, any soda bottle of 2 litres that was topped off with all of your parents' alcohol. A little from each. It didn't really matter what. We weren't exactly measuring. It'd be like 3 shots of vodka and 2 of gin and 1 of, port, rum, whatever. Just in a bottle with a soft drink, usually Pepsi or Fanta or something awful. And it would give you the most banging headache, the most terrible hangover. Just a little bit of all of your parents' liquors, all of your parents' spirits, all in a bottle mixed together. And then you would drink it as fast as possible. And I was getting blackout drunk by the time I was 16, easily. But we all were. It was unusual not to. I remember once being at my girlfriend's house when we were 15 or so. And I drank, it was in the afternoon, and I drank an entire bottle of Cointreau off her shelf when her parents owned it. And it was terrible. And it's strong stuff. And then I got home somehow, and I woke up in my own bed, still daylight. And I looked over to the side of the bed, and I'd thrown up into a perfectly circular orange pile of porridge. And my carpet, my floor in that bedroom was like carpet tiles, a little bit like a cheap school classroom. So I pulled up the tile with this perfectly round pudding of puke, and still drunk, and I opened my window and scraped the puke out of the window, and it landed with a big heavy splat on the roof of the conservatory, the kind of sunroom attached to the back of my parents' house with a and I didn't know that my parents were having a family dinner party right beneath it, and I'd scraped the puke off straight over my grandmother's head, only feet above her. And I saw the kind of silhouettes, and I heard the conversation go quiet. And then my mother, who was always very keen to defend me, too keen, I think, I heard her little voice go, "How big was that fucking bird?" At the time, that didn't seem unusual. We were all like that. I'm sure that if you're watching this, perhaps you were too. But looking back, the signs were there for me from the start, for sure. I was always a candidate, always a candidate. Head injury and stuff that's happened since, and various traumas and stuff, I was always a candidate. In fact, my childhood nickname became a euphemism for a kind of level of drunkenness that only a few people achieved, and it was when you were essentially unconscious from alcohol but still functional, still operating. My nickname was Nug, and if you drank to a certain level, which I was famous for doing, you would become nugged. So it'd be like, "Man, Warby, he was nugged last night," or "Did you hear about how nugged Phil got? My God," or whatever it is. I was embarrassed about that at the time. I wasn't one of those. I wasn't full of bravado like some other drinkers were. I wasn't proud of getting nugged, or that my propensity to be able to operate on huge amounts of alcohol had given birth to a name for that state. I wasn't proud of it. You would expect some people might be. I hated it. And it might even be worse than that, because my mother told me once that I was given brandy in my milk as a baby to help me sleep. And that doesn't sound very healthy, does it? But yeah, if you were drinking that young, you might be in trouble now. So that's number 5. Number 4, genetics and tolerance. So, related to the previous point, if you are the drunkest person in the room to the point that other people notice you are the drunkest person in the room, and if that happens semi-regularly, or if you can handle your drink, you're on a dangerous path. Being able to handle your liquor is kind of a virtue in our society. It's held up to be a signal of masculinity, machismo, or manliness, manhood. It doesn't just apply to men either. Anybody who can hold their liquor is part of the club. But if that's you, if you're the last person standing at a party, that's because you've built up a tolerance. And that's not good. Being able to resist the amount of poison you've put in your body, that's not something to be respected. It's not virtuous. If it was anything else, you'd stop, right? No one would ever be like, "Oh man, did you see how many times Dave stabbed himself last night? Dave's really good at getting stabbed. He's really good at stabbing himself. I wish I could stab myself like Dave. Dave's really cool." It's ridiculous, isn't it? But it's an extreme example, but it's essentially the same. That was me, man. Still standing after a fifth of whiskey, thinking I was friggin' Charles Bukowski. But if that is you, there is a chance that your propensity to handle your intoxicants is at least partially genetic. If one of your close relatives is a problem drinker, there's a good chance you are too. I come from an Irish family, obviously, and they are all big drinkers. And when I was young, I asked my dad, I was worried about this even when I was a teenager. I asked my dad if there was any alcoholism in the family, having a vague sense that there was a genetic component to it. And he said no, but there is. It's in my family. As an adult looking back, I can see it. The only difference is that no one in my family has died from it. That's it. Everyone lives 1,000,000 years in my family. We're very long-lived. It's very hard to kill us. But a long lifespan doesn't equal a healthy life. So if you're the drunkest in the room, or if you're the last one standing, or someone in your immediate family is either of those two things, you are at risk. Review your patterns of alcohol use and look for the signs. It's better to figure this stuff out before it gets bad. You don't want to learn how to fight once you're in the fight. 3, withdrawal. If you're starting to experience hangovers that no longer feel like hangovers, rather they feel like you've been poisoned, you're in danger. Nobody likes a hangover, but withdrawal is something completely different, far worse than a hangover. A hangover makes you restless and nauseated, and it gives you a headache and some anxiety. Alcohol withdrawal makes you feel like death is imminent. It makes you feel like you are about to die. You can feel it in your chest. It feels like there's something toxic in your veins, which of course there is. And as soon as you realise that what you're feeling is something like a hangover but is not a hangover, and then you need to be throwing out all the anchors, put the brakes on your drinking for a while, and do it quickly, because it only gets worse from there. Once you transition from hangovers to actual withdrawal, it only gets worse. It's no coming back. You don't go back to being a moderate drinker after that. It is over for you, especially if you've experienced anything like alcoholic hallucinosis or delirium tremens. There's no walking that back. It's a bit hard to describe the different sensations between a hangover and withdrawal, but I'm pretty sure you'll know it when you feel it. There's a chance that you're watching this video because you're wondering about it yourself. And if you're wondering about it, you have crossed over. If you're watching this because you're worried you might have a drinking problem, you do. That's terrible and too definitive to say. I don't like saying that, but I prefer a bracing truth to a comforting lie every time. When you feel that, when you feel like your hangovers are no longer hangovers, it will make you suspect that something has changed in you. If you're smart enough to recognize that something has changed in the way that your body is metabolizing alcohol, then you're smart enough to go and get help. Number 2, drinking alone. This one doesn't apply to everybody, but this video is mostly about my own patterns of drinking and my own experiences. I'm aware that a large portion of people can be sociable and also have an alcohol use disorder. Some people can be alcoholics and be very outgoing. That's for them to deal with, but it's not me. I began drinking alone quite early. About 20 years old. I was a student, and there had been some kind of argument between me and all of my housemates. And we hated each other, and we hated that house. It was awful. That house was terrible. The landlords didn't care. It was terrible. It was falling down. It was in a very rough area of Brighton in the UK. I remember that we had rats in the house. We had rats living with us. They were big enough and common enough that we named them. One was called Doug, and Doug was our favourite rat. He was the biggest. And one day in that house, in the winter, it got so cold that the rats died. It was that kind of place. That argument led us all to stay in our rooms and avoid each other as much as possible. And where we had usually been drinking together and going out together on the weekends, now we just receded to our rooms alone. And I remember drinking quite comfortably 4 litres of strong, cheap cider alone in that room. Just listening to music, or I don't even know what. I don't remember. It was 2005, so probably watching the Lord of the Rings Extended Edition DVD box set, back to back, over and over again, with the commentary on, then off, then on. After that, actually, after I graduated, I was sober for a long time. In my mid-20s, I used to call it teetotal back then, because sober had some alcoholism-y implications. So I used to tell people I was teetotal. And in that period, I got really fit. I used that sober time to become quite a good fighter for a while. Hence the broken nose and the missing teeth and stuff. But it all fell apart again around the age of 30, where I would turn up late and already drunk to parties, and then I would leave early so I could go and drink on my own. That's a massive red flag. If you do that, if that's part of your behaviour, then you're probably facing an alcohol use disorder for sure. Drinking alone, incidentally, doesn't necessarily mean just drinking hard liquor from the bottle in a darkened room on your own. For me, drinking alone quite often meant walking. And quite a few people who drink like me have gone, oh, I do that too, when I tell them about this. So I think it's more common than people expect. I wonder if you do it too. Quite a few people I talk to also love to do the thing that I love to do, which is just to walk. Walk and drink alone. Walking around cities or into the countryside or along the coast or wherever, completely alone, just you and a bottle of vodka or whiskey. Me and a bottle of vodka and whiskey. I used to pretend there was something romantic about it. There's a word for it, flaneur, someone who just walks. And I used to enjoy it, and I found other people in recovery used to do exactly the same thing. Maybe sometimes I would listen to music or a podcast or something, but usually not. Usually I would just walk, just wander with a bottle of whiskey in my inside pocket. In fact, what I would do, especially in Shanghai, where I lived, where it's very good to do this. This is a good place to do this kind of thing, unfortunately, was I would walk from Family Mart to Family Mart. It's like a 7-Eleven to 7-Eleven. And I would stop and get a small bottle of whiskey at each so that I wasn't carrying a massive one. And I would just drink them in sips as I just meandered the streets, ending up in strange and dangerous places. So if that's the way that you are drinking alone, it might not feel like it, but that is what you're doing. You are drinking alone. You're still drinking alone, and you've probably got an alcohol use disorder. Sorry. Okay, number one, the big one, the threshold. This is the most important thing, and it's absolutely the reason why I wanted to make this video, because when this occurred to me, I wanted to record it straight away, but I needed to give some structure and some context. I wanted to talk about this thing in particular. It's widely understood by people, including me, that there is no specific definition of an alcoholic. People are too different from each other. Everybody's journey through alcohol use is unique. And there is no single diagnosis that is common to all people with an alcohol use disorder. It's not a case of you either are or you're not. There's a huge amount of, it's a spectrum. There's a huge amount of grey area and different inflection points and nuances. In fact, it's a disease that is diagnosed by its symptoms rather than by any kind of pathology. So there is no set and agreed consensus or definition of an alcoholic. So I would like to propose one. I'd like to propose one, and I'd like to see if it makes sense and whether you agree or not. I need to choose my words very wisely here, because this is the kind of thing that has the potential to do harm as well as good. I have to be very clear, so bear with me. When people began to tell me that I had an alcohol problem, for a long time I did not agree. To me, and people who drink like me, which may be you, maybe not, the problem is not the alcohol. The problem is everything else. The alcohol is the medicine. To us, the alcohol is the medicine. We use it to alleviate our symptoms. But that doesn't last very long. You can do that for a while, but it doesn't last. Soon, the alcohol bleeds more and more into our daily lives, affecting personal and professional relationships more and more, and increasingly affecting our mood, until the alcohol is a bigger problem than the problems we were using it to treat. Let me have another go at that. While some of us are using alcohol to try to treat the external problems all around us, soon the alcohol will get on top of us to the point where the alcohol is itself a problem. A bigger problem than the original problem that started us drinking. Does that make sense? So before you know it, you are drinking to treat the negative feelings caused by drinking. And at that point, you are on the edge of a precipice. You are staring straight down into the abyss. And there's nothing good down there. Nothing. I've been there. You're already in a tailspin. You're already chasing your tail at that point because you're going to be drinking increasing amounts of alcohol to try to medicate exponentially worse problems. It's both things, your problems and the amount of alcohol you're consuming are exponential. More alcohol causes more problems, and more problems cause more alcohol, which cause more problems, which causes more alcohol. That is the definition of a spiral. That's not the definition of a spiral, but you know what I mean. And that is the threshold. That is the threshold. That's it. Let me explain. As soon as you start using alcohol to medicate against the problems caused by alcohol, then you are an alcoholic. When the alcohol becomes a bigger problem than the problems that made you use alcohol in the first place, then it is time to go to the sink and empty the bottles down it. And then throw the bottles out so you won't pick them up in the morning just to test if there's any left. Then get sober. Sober up. And then open the mail that you've been putting off. Open your emails that you've been dreading to look at. Come and join us. So what do you think? Is that definition, is that threshold a good one? Is it useful? Is it realistic? Is it anything? Is it a workable definition? Is it anything? Do you remember a point where that happened to you? I do. Are you experiencing it now? I hope not. I hope you're not going through that right now. But that's what it is for me. That is my threshold and that is my definition. Anyway, that's enough of my stupid face today. Like, comment and subscribe. And as always, keep on quitting. Good luck out there.